If you've ever wondered exactly what you need in order to start your own silversmithing journey, this is the video for you. Hey everyone, it's Jen B, and welcome to my studio. Today's video is going to be the first video in a Start Silversmithing series that I am starting to do. I am going to be going over all of the tools and supplies that I think are essential when you are just starting out on a silversmithing journey. I have set up a kind of replica of what my home studio looked like before I moved into my current studio situation. And this is a setup that anybody can do in their home, which is what I did and what I started with. So for this Start Silversmithing journey, you will see a number of different videos. This one that you are watching is going to go over all the tools and supplies that I feel are essential for you to begin your silversmithing journey. From there, I'll be going into some beginner project videos where you will get an in-depth explanation of how to complete some of your very first silversmithing projects. I hope that you will subscribe and turn on notifications so that you can be aware of when those videos are posted. All right, so let's start with video 1 in this series, which is going to talk all about the tools and supplies that I feel are essential for someone who is just starting out on their silversmithing journey. I know that there are tons of videos already out there on YouTube and the internet, but this is my personal recommendations as someone who started soldering with no silversmithing or metalsmithing experience. I had to piece together what I needed from all those videos. I am breaking this video up into different chapters for organizational reasons, so make sure you check the description down below for the different chapters and subjects that we'll be talking about, and also a detailed list of all of the items that I recommend in this video. So I will be right back, and we will start talking about chapter 1, which is all about safety. All right, welcome back to chapter 1, where we are going to talk all about safety. Before you even think about getting a torch, you should have your safety considerations figured out and have what you need. And I'm going to be going over some of the items that I think are essential when it comes to safety. First and foremost is, of course, a fire extinguisher. You are going to be working with a torch, which has a flame, obviously, and so having a working fire extinguisher is non-negotiable. You need to have one, and it needs to be close by. You do not want, in case of an emergency, to run all the way across your house looking for the fire extinguisher you might have. You need to have one right in the area where you are doing your soldering. This is essential and non-negotiable. I also, in my studio, have a fire blanket because I just feel better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. This is not essential to get, but I do think it is a good idea to consider putting on your list of safety items to purchase. Okay, so let's talk a moment about keeping your surface protected. You want to think about a way to kind of keep your surface safe from the heat and from chemicals that you use in the silversmithing process. And I did that by going to the hardware store and purchasing some of these ceramic tiles. And I just laid 2 of them next to each other. And this is where I did all of my soldering. Now, you can't solder directly on these ceramic tiles, but the point of these is to protect your surface underneath it from heat and the chemicals that we use. Now, to further keep my surface protected, I used a baking pan, much like this one. This one I got at the Dollar Tree for $1.25, so it doesn't have to be anything expensive or fancy. And this is where I would do my soldering. I would put down a soldering surface and do all my work. And should metal fall off or roll off of the soldering board, it would likely be stopped by the rim on the baking pan. And that was just further insurance that I wasn't going to have an issue with metal going off onto my table or onto the floor. So, again, this is just my personal recommendation. Let's talk a brief moment about eye safety. I think it is common sense that you will want some sort of eye protection when you are working with a flame, if you are working with metals and cutting metals and using a rotary tool to polish. You definitely want to wear eye protection. I particularly like these ones because they have protection all the way around the eye, and these are fog free, which I find very beneficial, especially if you are wearing a mask. The fog free feature of these safety goggles works really, really well. So grab yourself a pair of safety goggles, any kind. I will have this particular one linked below because I do like all of the features of them, but of course, you purchase what you would like. The last thing that I would urge you to consider when you are thinking about safety is your ventilation system and protecting your lungs. We are working with fumes and particulate, and you do not want to breathe that in and get it into your lungs. If you are not working in a well ventilated area, or if you're in a place where you don't have a window, I would recommend wearing a respirator. I don't personally have a respirator to show you because I've never worn one. In my sewing room, I would open the window and make sure that I had a fan pointed in that direction so that the fumes were more likely to go out the window. And now in my studio, I have a fume extraction system that keeps me safe from the fumes. But if you do not have good ventilation, I would highly, highly recommend a respirator. I would also highly recommend a particulate mask. When you are polishing or grinding metals, there are particulates getting into the air, and you do not want to breathe those into your lungs. So, wearing a particulate mask is really, really important. I know we don't like to wear masks, but it is essential to keep your lungs safe. So please consider using a respirator and a particulate mask in your silversmithing journey. All right, I think that covers everything that I wanted to talk about when it comes to safety. There are other things that you can do, like wearing a silversmithing apron, wearing closed toed shoes, or even steel toed shoes to protect yourself. But those are things that you can think about down the line. And these are just the essentials that I think you must have in order to start silversmithing. So, we are ready to move on to chapter 2, where we are going to talk all about surfaces and torches for beginning silversmiths. I will be right back. So, in this chapter, we are going to start talking about soldering surfaces and torches for beginning silversmiths. Now, there is a ton of personal opinions about what is the best soldering surface and torch to use when you are just starting out. And of course, I have my own opinion, and these are the ones that I am going to suggest as a beginner once myself, and still kind of more towards the beginning side of silversmithing. These are the things that I would personally recommend as the best. So let's start off with torches and then we'll talk about the surfaces. When you are thinking about what torch to get for your first torch, most of the time people use butane as their fuel of choice because you can get it easily, it burns cleanly, and it is not as scary as a setup as, say, a propane oxygen setup or an acetylene oxygen setup. So butane is a lot less intimidating and the torches are very easily accessible. The two torches or the two butane torches that I would recommend is something like a micro torch and a little bit bigger of a torch that snaps onto a can of butane. And I'm going to talk about both of these. All right, so let's start off with a micro torch. This particular micro torch I got off of Amazon and I've been testing it out because I do not have my original micro torch anymore. But this will be linked below. And these micro torches are perfect for small projects. These definitely cannot get metal hot enough to do larger projects easily. And so these micro torches are really great for small projects. And when I say small projects, I'm talking about something small like this or a simple ring. You definitely cannot solder huge, gigantic statement rings or necklaces with a micro torch. But a torch like this is a little bit less intimidating, or I should say the flame is a little less intimidating than the other torch that I'll be showing you. The micro torch has a much tighter, smaller flame, and that makes it perfect for small projects or soldering jump ring or chains. Again, small rings, small pendants. And this is a perfectly viable torch to get, especially if you are nervous about working with flames. The flame is not as scary as the other torch. This particular torch needs a can of butane that you fill. And I should mention that there are different sizes of refillable butane torches. I don't happen to have any because for my bigger butane torch, I use the snap-on head, which I'll talk about in a minute. But anyway, for a refillable torch, you need a can of butane that has that type of nozzle on it, and you fill it on the bottom. I'm not going to fill it in this video, but just want you to be aware that with a refillable torch, you need to buy a can of butane. And if you know right away that you are going to want to work on bigger projects, I would suggest getting the snap-on head that is for a can of butane. The flame that this one produces is much larger and it will heat up metal much quicker and efficient than a tiny micro torch will. There are many different kinds of snap-on heads, and this particular one is my very favorite, and it unfortunately is going to be discontinued, but I will show you that this one snaps on and screws on, and this is the type of can of butane that you need for this type of torch. It has a little notch, and this one snaps right on, and the reason I like this one is because it screws, but like I said, it's not available anymore. This type of butane torch, like I said, has a much larger flame and it can be intimidating. And people think that they can't do small projects with a gigantic flame like this, but you can. You can completely do small projects with this. You just have to practice your flame control and make sure that the metal isn't getting too hot that you end up melting it. So if I was to suggest one torch, it would be the snap-on head type because this is going to take you very far in your soldering journey. I have made very small pieces and very large pieces with this particular type of torch. So let's compare the flames. I think seeing a flame is helpful. in gauging whether or not you feel comfortable using it. This torch has a little safety right here. And one thing that I definitely want to talk about is, I'm going to put that there so hopefully you can see the flame a little bit better. Always point the nozzle away from you. When you are using the torch, obviously you do not want to burn yourself. Nozzle needs to be pointing away. When you set your torch down, it should also be pointing away from you. And you do not want to touch the nozzle because it gets very hot. I know all that seems like it's self-explanatory, but you would be surprised when you're in the moment how you might forget those types of things. Also, you do not want to have long sleeves in the way, and you want your hair pulled back if you have long hair. All right, so let's turn this on. I'm going to be turning this knob to start the gas and then pressing the ignite button. So you'll hear a little hiss, and there it is. Hopefully I have this angled correctly, and you can see the flame that comes out of this type of torch. I'm just going to come down here and pretend that I'm soldering on this surface, and hopefully you can see the flame. So that is the flame that comes from a micro torch. To turn off the flame, you just turn off the gas. And then for this one, when I'm done using it, put the safety back on. All right, so let's talk about the snap-on butane torch head. Again, this is my favorite beginner torch head because it is going to take you through a variety of beginner to advanced projects. And yes, it is a little bit more scary. The flame is stronger and bigger, but if you purchase something like this, you're not going to have to upgrade for a little while. And when you're already spending money getting all these supplies together, it's helpful to not have to upgrade and switch torches quickly. And I know that this has an intimidating flame, but I promise you can do it. Okay, so for this one, there is a safety under here that I'm going to open. I'm going to turn the knob to turn on the gas and then ignite it with this switch down here. And there we go. I am sure that you can see, hopefully, that that is a much bigger and more robust flame than the other one. Let me just kind of get down here, and you can see as though I was soldering. I know this seems a little scary, but like I said, this torch head will stay with you for quite a while. All right, I got that turned off. We'll turn the safety back on. So I do know that this can be intimidating, but this torch head is a great first torch, which will take you very far in your silversmithing journey. All right, so these are the two types of torches that I would recommend. You don't need both, just one or the other to start with. This one if you're feeling a little nervous and want a smaller flame. This one if you are going to want a torch that will carry you through lots of different projects. All right, let's talk about soldering surfaces. Since we are using butane torches in a home studio setup like this, we need to use soldering surfaces that are going to help us with our heat. Butane torches cannot produce as much heat as something like a propane oxygen or acetylene oxygen combination would. And so if we want to get the most bang for our buck out of these torches, we need to use soldering surfaces that reflect heat back to our project. And both of these types of soldering surfaces do just that. Which one you choose is really up to you. I like both of them. I use both of them all the time. So this one is called a solderite board. And I have just cleaned off this side of the solderite board. But as you use it, it looks like this. It discolors and gets gunky with flux. But what I like about these is you don't have to go out and buy a brand new one. You just use some sandpaper and sand away all of that gunk, and they are able to be used again. Now, you do have to repurchase these eventually, but um, you can get a lot of use out of them before that happens. And I like this because the size is good for lots of different projects, and it is excellent at reflecting the heat back to your project, which will really, really help when you are using a butane torch. And the other soldering surface that is also very good for beginners to use is a compressed charcoal block. It also is excellent at reflecting the heat back to your project and is a wonderful choice. These are really good if you need to make something like granulation or set up soldering, like a more difficult soldering operation, because you can grind and carve out sections of the charcoal where you could prop things up. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but I have created little divots on this side for when I want to create perfectly round balls. So this is a great beginner soldering surface as well. And now I've got charcoal all over my fingers. Would I recommend one over the other? It's hard to say. If you're only going to get one, I would probably say that the charcoal block would take you a little bit further in your journey because of the option to carve into the charcoal and create divots and little crevices to hold complex soldering operations. With something like the solderite board, you have to think more about using a third hand to hold complex soldering operations, and this cannot be carved into. With that said, the solderite board is my favorite soldering board, but I am not recommending a third hand in this video. So if you are looking for something that you can set up soldering operations without having to buy more supplies, then the charcoal block is the way to go. Do make sure when you get a charcoal block that it is the compressed charcoal block. You can also file and sand these smooth again. You can see on this side it's kind of dirty with flux, but just taking sandpaper and cleaning that off works great. So those are the soldering surfaces that I would recommend. Okay, so we talked about 2 soldering surfaces and 2 torches that you can consider getting. You are going to do great with any of these. It's just a matter of what you feel comfortable with when it comes to the torches and what kind of surface you would like. Do you want a surface that you may need some extra tools to set things up, or do you want a surface where you can just use the surface if need be? And that is all that I have to talk to you about torches and surfaces. There's a lot more that could be said about soldering surfaces and torches, but these are simply the recommendations that I have for beginners. All right, I will see you in the next chapter where we are going to talk about soldering tools. All right, so welcome to chapter 3, where we are going to talk about some general tools that you will need to solder. I know that this looks like a lot of things, but I've really tried to pare it down and just talk about the basics. Let's start with the most important thing that you will need, and that is solder. I would recommend getting sheet solder. A lot of people would recommend that beginners start with paste solder, which is like a little paste that you would paint on the metal that contains flux and solder in one. However, I found that very messy. I didn't like to use it, and I would much rather use sheet solder. Solder comes in wire form, sheet form, and paste form. I would recommend getting sheet solder because you can cut up the sheet solder and get exactly the sizes that you need. The two here that I'm showing you are easy solder and medium solder. If you were only going to get one solder, I would probably recommend easy for very, very beginners because it flows at a lower temperature than medium or hard. And so you have less risk of melting your piece if you're using easy solder. Typically, when you're soldering, you start with hard solder and you move down to medium and easy as you get to the final parts of the project. But for very beginners, you don't need to worry about that. And I would suggest either getting easy or medium or both. But if you're just going to get one, easy would be the way to go. I use some little Fisker shears to cut up my sheet solder. These are also really good at cutting sheet metal. So I will have this in the description bar. These are very inexpensive and great for cutting the solder and for thinner sheet metal. In order to get your solder to flow, you need a flux. And there is a paste flux. So this is flux that comes in a jar and it is a paste. I'm not going to open it because it gets everywhere and it's very messy. Or you can get a liquid flux that you need to spray onto your piece or dribble onto it. So if you go with the liquid flux route, you would want to get a little spray bottle. Let me show you my spray bottle. My spray bottle looks like this. It gives a very nice fine mist spray and covers my piece really nicely. The reason that I like spray flux over paste flux is because this protects your metal. You spray this over your entire piece and it protects the piece from exposure to a lot of heat, which can cause fire scale and fire stain. So I recommend liquid flux or spray flux over paste flux if you are just starting. The paste flux would be put just on the seam, and it is a fine flux, and I use it in my studio for certain things, but 99% of the time I am using my spray flux in a spray bottle. So I would highly recommend starting with a spray flux, and I will have this specific one linked down in the description. You also need a couple things when you are soldering, like a soldering pick and some insulated tweezers. And you will see that my insulated tweezers have been very loved and have been burnt a couple times. It happens. And a soldering pick. The soldering pick is for you to place solder, move it around, nudge things into place as you're soldering. This is like one of the very first solder picks that I got, and it works fine. You do not have to spend a ton of money and get an expensive soldering pick. A simple one with a titanium handle so that you don't feel the heat from the flame is going to serve you just fine. With the soldering tweezers, you use that to pick up pieces, dip it in the quench. You use this to place your solder if needed, but insulated tweezers and a soldering pick are things that you definitely want to have. You need a quench bowl, and this is a simple dog bowl that I got at Walmart, I think, for like $2.50 or something. And this works perfect to take your pieces. Let's see if I can pretend as though I'm taking a piece off my soldering board and putting it in the quench bowl, just like that. You never see me do this on camera because I'm always off camera, or my quench bowl is always off camera. I personally keep my quench bowl behind me so that I'm not knocking it over with my torch hand. I use my left hand for my torch hand, and so I just prefer to reach back there and dip it into the quench bowl. But you will create your own setup as you get into your silversmithing. The next thing that you need is some pickle. And pickle is what is used to remove the oxidation. When you are heating up your metal, it is getting oxidized and you need a way to remove that. And there's two ways to remove it. You can soak it in an acid like pickle, or you can remove it using filing and sanding. Pickling is typically what is used to remove that oxidation, and I'm going to show you a very simple beginning pickle setup. First, let's talk about the pickle. This is a chemical. You need to take precautions when you are using it. You do not want to breathe this in. You don't want it on your skin. And when it is warm is when it works the best, but it unfortunately lets out fumes when it is warm, and you do not, under any circumstances, want to breathe in those fumes. So when you're working with this or getting things out of the pickle, if you do not have a fume extractor or you don't have good ventilation, please wear a respirator. For the sake of your lungs, please take care of them and wear masks and respirators as needed. But this particular pickle is sodium bisulfate. It is excellent at removing the pickle, or it is excellent at removing the oxidation that occurs when we are soldering. If you do not feel comfortable using a chemical like this, you can use citric acid, which you can get at grocery stores in the baking section, I believe. And citric acid will remove the oxidation, and it's a little bit more natural of a product, but it does take a little bit longer, and it can get a little moldy if it sits for a long time in your pickle jar. So let's talk about a pickle jar. I have seen a lot of people use crock pots, and again, when you are just starting out and you have a very small space to set up, you may not be able to have an entire crock pot dedicated to pickle. A much easier thing to do is to have a mason jar that is mixed with your water and pickle, and then heat it up on a mug warmer. And it is as simple as that. Warm pickle works best, and so this is a really great and easy beginner setup. When you are done soldering, you quench it and then you drop it in the pickle. You do not want to quench your pieces in the pickle. You might be thinking, well, why can't I take my piece from here and drop it in the pickle? Some people do that, but when you do that, it does let out some fumes and vapor as you drop it in there. And those are very, very dangerous to breathe in. So I always keep my pickle covered, and I do not breathe in any of the fumes when I am putting something in it. And I personally always quench and then put my piece in the pickle. So for your pickle, whichever one you use, this one back here tells you how much pickle to use for how much water. So you mix water and your pickle, and then you put it on the mug warmer and heat it up, and it just works a treat. It works great, and this is a wonderful setup for your pickle. Now for your pickle, to get things in and out, you want to use copper tongs. Anything but copper tongs will contaminate your pickle, and we do not want to do that. You don't want your pieces to be coated in any sort of contamination. If your pickle is contaminated with a different type of metal, it will actually coat your silver with a layer of copper, and you don't want to do that. So copper tongs to put things in and out of the pickle, and then I always rinse off all of my pieces in a baking soda water solution to neutralize the pickle. You might notice that my baking soda solution has a blue tint to it. And in fact, this has a blue tint to it as well, this pickle solution. And that is because when a piece is heated up and there's oxidation on the piece, when it is pickled, that copper oxide that is on the surface of your piece then gets into the water. So the copper oxide is floating around in the water and it gives it a blue tint. So that's why your pickle may be blue, is because there's copper. And something very, very important to know is that you cannot pour these down the drain. We do not want these copper oxides getting into our water supply. So you need to make sure that you have a way to dispose your spent pickle or your baking soda water in a safe way. I have outside a huge bucket that I got from the hardware store and that I use kitty litter whenever I need to pour out my pickle. I neutralize my pickle with baking soda and then I pour that into the bucket and make sure it's covered with kitty litter. Same with my baking soda solution. It goes in the bucket and more kitty litter is added. And once I fill that up to the top, I will take it to my local hazardous waste. But no matter what, these do not go down the drain. Even if you are not using this type of pickle and you're using citric acid, you don't want to put it down the drain because it is going to contain copper oxides. Editing Jen here, and I realized I left a tool out of this section that I wanted to recommend, and that is a pair of cross-locking tweezers. These are really helpful when you're soldering for setting up things like a ring band on a ring shank or an ear post on an earring. A lot of times you see these come in third hands, and you could definitely purchase a third hand if you would like, but you actually don't need one. Just the insulated tweezers or the insulated cross-locking tweezers will allow you to set things up by putting it in the tweezers and then setting it where it needs to go and kind of balancing it. They work just fine without a third hand. Do I use a third hand? Yes, I personally do sometimes, but in the beginning, you are able to set up soldering operations with just a board that you can carve into, like a charcoal block, and a pair of cross-locking tweezers. So this will also be added to the list. And now back to this section. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter where we covered the basic soldering tools that you will need. One other thing that I forgot to mention is if you are going to use wire or sheet solder, you will want little containers to put your cut up pieces of solder into and mark them clearly. This is for my medium solder. And yeah, just a little mention. All right, I am going to switch all this out and we are going to get to the final chapter where we're going to talk about some of the basic jewelry making tools that I think you will need once you have done your soldering. So I will see you in a moment. We have made it to the last section of this video where we are going to be talking about the tools that I would recommend you get so that you are prepared to begin your silversmithing journey. Tools for jewelry making are definitely not inexpensive, and I've really tried to pare it down to the basics that you will need. And from there, you can always add in other tools. I would also mention that when you are purchasing your tools, buying the best that you can afford is the way to go, because you don't want to buy something really, really cheap and then have to upgrade it very quickly because the quality is so inferior to something that is a little bit more expensive. Now, I get that budgets are limited. My budget was limited, and I purchased what I could when I could, but I've also been collecting tools for quite a while. So don't feel like you need to go out and purchase really expensive things, but also I wouldn't recommend skimping and buying the cheapest thing. With that said, I have some items here that will get you started without spending a fortune. Let's start with talking about the pliers that I would recommend. I would recommend that you get 2 pairs of flat nose pliers. These are really going to come in handy for shaping metal, for opening and closing jump rings, and having 2 pairs of flat nose just makes it easier because you can hold one in each hand as you are opening things and closing things. And this is really all you need. It's just 2 flat nose pliers. In addition to 2 flat nose pliers, I would recommend you get some round nose pliers. These are obviously going to help you form curves and things like jump rings and bails. They do make specific pliers just for making bails and jump rings, but all of that can be done with a simple pair of round nose pliers. In addition to the round nose and flat nose pliers, you are going to want some sort of cutters. You need to have a way to easily cut your metal. So I happen to have 2 different pairs only because I started with one and then later learned that this pair only cuts very small or thin gauges of wire, and had to quickly move up to something that cuts larger gauges of wire. I will leave in my list a pair of cutters that comes highly recommended from other silversmiths and will allow you to buy just 1 pair. Now, they are a little bit more on the pricey side, and that's because a good pair of cutters is indispensable when you are silversmithing. So a pair of flush cutters to cut your metal or to cut your wire is needed. You will also need a way to cut sheet metal. These Fisker shears do a great job at cutting up solder or sheet solder and thinner gauges of sheet metal. And they're fairly inexpensive. They don't last a really, really long time, but they are great to start out with. Or you could get something that is a little bit more heavy duty to cut sheet metal with. I'll also say right here that you could get a jeweler's saw and some saw blades to cut your sheet metal, but I find and also experienced as a new silversmith that sawing was very intimidating, and so I just started with shears and then later moved into using a jeweler's saw, and now I rarely use these to cut my sheet metal. I just use these Fiskers to cut my sheet solder. So you will need a way to cut your metal, whether it's shears or a jeweler's saw, that is up to you. A couple other miscellaneous tools. A pair of digital calipers is a great, great thing to have. You've often got to measure, and we typically use millimeters in jewelry making, and you will often have to measure the diameter of things, the diameter of the wire, the diameter of your stones, whatever it may be. So having a pair of digital calipers is great. I got these ones very inexpensively at Harbor Freight. A couple other things I got very inexpensively were some files. You do need to have some files to file the edges of your wires to make sure that things are flat and smooth. And this pair of needle files came from Harbor Freight for very, very inexpensive. You could essentially just get this and be fine. However, I do recommend getting a larger file. This is just a bastard file that I got either at Harbor Freight or another hardware store, I can't remember. And you do not need a fancy handle for it. You don't even really need a handle at all for these. I personally like to put a Prosecco cork on the end of my files because it just sits really, really comfortably in my hand as I am filing. So I would recommend getting a cheap bastard file. This will file metal very quickly, and then you can always refine the edges with some finer needle files. For shaping metal, especially if you are doing rings or anything that is round and has a curve, you will want a ring mandrel. Now these can get very, very pricey. I would recommend getting the best that you can afford right now because you do hammer on these a lot. And so you want something that can take that kind of a beating without having to upgrade quickly because it was worn out. You will want a rubber or nylon mallet. I'm going to put that mandrel down because it is so heavy. You'll want a nylon or a rubber mallet. There's actually a great one at Harbor Freight, I believe, and if I can find the link for it, I'll make sure to include that one in the list as well. But the nylon and rubber mallets will form your metal without putting marks on them. So this is really a great tool to have. I'm not going to include in this list a planishing hammer because I don't think you necessarily need one right when you're starting. And again, trying to keep the costs down, a nylon or rubber mallet is going to be just fine in the beginning. You'll also want a bench block. You can see that I have a very small bench block. This is actually the first bench block that I ever purchased, and it has stayed with me this long, and I've had to clean off rust and whatnot from it multiple times, but these are very heavy and they last a long time. So you don't need a huge bench block, just a small one is fine. And you use this to do some hammering if you put texture on your metal, if you need to flatten your metal or your wires. That is what a bench block is for. I have my bench block sitting on a leather sandbag. It's up to you whether you get one of these. You don't have to. You can actually just use like a rolled up towel, but these are just to help with a little bit of the sound dampening. And I don't have a lot of sound dampening in my studio, so anything that I can use to help dampen the sound of hammering, I definitely try to do. Editing Jen here again to insert a little clip talking about two things that I forgot to include. And I even made a list, but this is not atypical of Gen B to forget what's on a list. You'd think I'd look at the list. Not me. Anyway, one thing that you definitely want to consider getting for your home studio when you start silversmithing is a bench pin. While not absolutely essential, this is really nice to have, especially if you're going to be sawing things out, if you're going to get a jeweler saw. It's a nice place to rest your hands when you are filing. And you can get a very inexpensive one that clamps onto your table. Something else I would most definitely recommend is a metal hole punch, especially if you're going to want to be making components for things to drop from or earrings that need to dangle on an ear wire. You need a way to get a hole in your metal. And if you had a flex shaft or a rotary tool, you could use a drill bit. But again, since this is geared for beginners, I'm going to recommend getting a hole punch. And these items will be included on the list in the description for you to check out. Okay, back to the actual video. When you are finished with your project and you are ready to finish it up and polish it, there's a couple tools that you will need in order to do that. A lot of jewelry makers or silversmiths have a rotary tool, and there are cheaper rotary tools out on the market. You can actually get a little Dremel substitute at Harbor Freight that works perfect. That is what I started with. no clue where mine is. My husband borrowed it, so who knows where it ended up. But you don't have to have a rotary tool. You can do all of your sanding and finishing and polishing by hand just by getting some little pieces of sandpaper. I keep mine on a clipboard, and if I needed to tear this up and use smaller pieces to finish a project, I could definitely do that. But I keep mine all on a clipboard, and since I have a rotary tool, that's typically what I use. But having just some smaller pieces of sandpaper to finish your pieces is completely perfect. It takes a little bit extra time to sand and polish by hand, but it is definitely more cost effective than going out and purchasing a rotary tool and all of the bits that go with that. In addition to sandpaper, you can get just cheap nail files. These are these ones I got from Amazon, but these ones I got from my local Sally Beauty Supply. And you can use these to finish your piece, to refine your edges, to polish. You can get buffing blocks. I don't have one right here in my studio, but you can get buffing blocks that help to polish your pieces. And these are very cost effective and very cheap. So don't think you have to go out and spend a lot of money getting all these things to finish and polish your pieces. They can be done very simply and inexpensively with just sandpaper and nail files from the beauty supply. I believe that covers everything that I wanted to talk about in this very first video on starting to silversmith. I hope that it wasn't too overwhelming. I know that I covered a lot of items. You can revisit this video whenever you need to, and everything that I talked about is listed down below. And where I could, I linked the products that I was talking about just to make it easier for you to see them and find them. I'm really excited about starting this beginner series, and I had a lot of fun putting this video together. It did take a little bit of time, but I think it was worth it. And I personally wish that I had had a video that was just kind of straightforward, telling me exactly what I needed to get when I started. And maybe there are videos out there that I just didn't realize. Doesn't matter, because now I have my own. And again, these are just my personal recommendations with the things that I have experience with as a beginner silversmith. Thank you so much for joining me for this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.